My mother-in-law pushed me down the stairs in front of my father. He didn't say a word at first. But when I woke up in the hospital, he was already making her regret ever touching me. The pain shot through my body, my ribs screaming, my wrists swollen and useless. I could barely move, and yet my mind raced back through everything that had led to this moment. I had always tried to be polite and patient with Ruth. From the first time I met her, she had a cold way of looking at me, as if she was already deciding I wasn't good enough for her son. At family dinners, she would drop small, cutting comments, and Evan would just shrug or laugh them off. I thought I could ignore it, that love would protect me, but the cracks were growing deeper every day. The argument started over something trivial, a misplaced dish, a careless word. But it quickly escalated. Ruth's voice became sharp, her hands shaking with anger. She had always been controlling, but I never imagined she would actually hurt me. And then she shoved me. One second I was standing, the next I was tumbling down the stairs, every step slamming into me like fire. The world blurred around me, and my father's face hovered above, frozen in shock. I remembered Evan standing by, frozen too, not moving to help me, not saying anything to stop his mother. I realized then that he had always been loyal to Ruth in ways that hurt me. All those times I felt belittled, dismissed, or invisible, it wasn't just stress or bad luck. It was a pattern, one that Ruth carefully crafted, and Evan followed without question. Lying at the bottom of the stairs, I felt fear and anger mix into a strange calm. I remembered the moments I had brushed off, the whispered insults, the quiet manipulations. My body hurt, but my mind began to focus. I could see the beginnings of a plan forming, even as the nurses lifted me into the ambulance. My father didn't speak, but his eyes burned with a quiet rage that said everything. By the time I woke up in the hospital, the fear had shifted into something else. I wasn't powerless anymore. I was hurt, yes, but I was seen, and someone was already making sure that Ruth would pay for what she had done. It was terrifying, yes, but also strangely reassuring. I knew my life had changed in that instant, and nothing would ever be the same again. The woman who had tried to destroy me had awakened a fire she could never put out. Even in pain, even with my body aching, I felt the first glimmer of strength. My father's presence reminded me that I wasn't alone. And in that moment, I understood that revenge, when it came, would be inevitable, and it would be nothing short of deserved. I remember the first time I met Ruth. She was elegant, always perfectly dressed, her smile polite but distant. But beneath that polite surface, there was something cold, controlling. From the very start, she made it clear that no one could ever be good enough for her son. Her questions were sharp, her compliments rare, and I quickly realized that every word I said was being measured, judged. After the wedding, her subtle jabs became more obvious. At family dinners, she would comment on how I cooked or the way I dressed. Every small mistake I made seemed to give her satisfaction. Evan used to be warm and attentive, but slowly he started changing. He became distant, quieter, and his words often reflected her criticisms. I would try to explain myself, but he would brush it off, siding with his mother without question. The emotional weight was exhausting. I spent countless hours trying to please everyone, making sure nothing I did would set Ruth off. I would plan dinners carefully, adjust my clothing and tone, even laugh at jokes that weren't funny, all to keep the peace. But no matter what I did, there was always something wrong. I felt trapped in a constant cycle of trying and failing. Family gatherings were the worst. Every meal was tense, conversations loaded with hidden meaning. Ruth had this way of turning people against each other without ever raising her voice. You would think it was harmless, just her being opinionated, but it wore on me. I started to feel invisible, like nothing I did could ever earn her respect. Through it all, my father watched quietly. Richard didn't like Evan's family, he never had. But he trusted my judgment, believing I could handle myself. He rarely interfered, letting me navigate the tension on my own. He would sometimes give me a look, a small nod of support, but he never spoke directly to Ruth about her behavior. Even so, I could feel the tension growing inside me. Every day, the small things added up. The sarcastic comments, the pointed questions, the way Evan would avoid me when his mother was around. It was like living in a house where no one was truly on your side. I felt drained and alone, trying to hold myself together while the emotional abuse slowly built like a storm cloud overhead. Looking back, I can see how it all started, the quiet cruelty, the hidden hostility. Ruth's influence over Evan and the way she manipulated every interaction created a toxic environment that made me question myself constantly. And yet I kept trying, hoping that love and patience could make it better. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, some families are too toxic to fix, and some battles are only revealed when the storm finally hits. I began noticing changes in Evan that made my stomach twist with worry. He started hiding his phone whenever I was around, closing messages too quickly when I entered the room. He came home later and later, making excuses about work or traffic, but I could feel the distance growing between us. Nights we used to share laughter and closeness became silent, cold, and awkward. I tried to talk to him, but he would brush me off, leaving me confused and hurt. Ruth didn't make it any easier. She had this way of planting seeds of doubt in Evan's mind, always hinting that I wasn't good enough for him. Sometimes she would casually comment on my cooking or the way I dressed, and I could see Evan's reactions: hesitation, quiet agreement, or a dismissive shrug. I started feeling like I was losing the man I loved, and worse, that I couldn't compete with his mother's influence. One night, I couldn't sleep and went into the living room, only to hear a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Ruth was talking to Evan, her voice low but sharp. She told him that divorcing me would be the smartest thing he could ever do. My heart froze. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. Hearing those words, knowing my husband's mother was actively trying to turn him against me, shattered something inside me. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and completely alone. Even then, I tried to believe that Evan still loved me, that he would protect me from her manipulations. But his behavior told another story. He avoided eye contact, made excuses, and kept me at a distance I didn't understand. The intimacy we once shared vanished, replaced with awkwardness and coldness. I began doubting myself, wondering if I had missed something, if I had failed him somehow. My father noticed the change too. Richard watched quietly, his eyes following our interactions with concern. He didn't interfere directly, but I could sense his worry. He would sometimes give me a look, a small nod that said he knew something wasn't right. He seemed to understand that I was trapped in a growing storm, but he trusted me to handle it in my own way, giving me strength without pushing me. The tension in our marriage grew heavier each day. I felt like I was walking on thin ice, unsure when it might crack completely. Every interaction with Evan or Ruth felt like navigating a battlefield. I wanted to hold on, to save our love, but the constant emotional pressure wore me down. The distance, the secret conversations, the doubts, it was all breaking my spirit little by little. By the time the breaking point arrived, I felt fragile and exposed, unsure of who I could trust. Evan's distance, Ruth's manipulations, and the invisible weight of their combined influence had created a storm I wasn't ready for. But it was coming, and there was no escaping it. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Something in Evan's behavior had changed completely. He was distant, secretive, and cold. One day, while looking for a document he had left behind, I stumbled upon messages on his phone. My heart sank as I read them. He had been seeing his ex-girlfriend, Lauren Dwyer, behind my back. The texts were full of affection, plans, and lies. I couldn't believe it. After everything, he had betrayed me. Worse, I realized Ruth knew about it all. I had overheard snippets of her conversations with Evan, where she encouraged him, telling him I wasn't right for him and that he could do better. It was like a knife twisting in my chest. Not only had my husband cheated, but his mother had been part of it, fueling the betrayal. I confronted Evan that evening at Ruth's house, hoping for denial, for anger, anything that would let me believe it wasn't true. But he didn't even try. He looked at me with cold eyes and said I was being too dramatic, that I was overreacting, that I was imagining things. His words felt like a slap, making me feel small and powerless. Tensions flared quickly. Ruth, standing nearby, didn't offer comfort or try to stop him. Instead, she laughed at my anger, taunting me, pushing my emotions higher. I tried to stay calm, to keep my composure, but the room felt suffocating. Every word, every glance made me angrier and more desperate. Then it happened. In a sudden, violent motion, Ruth shoved me. I lost my balance, tumbling down the stairs. Pain exploded through my body as I hit each step, every bruise a reminder of her cruelty. The world spun around me, and I couldn't catch my breath. All I could hear were my father's footsteps rushing toward me and Ruth's startled gasp. Richard had arrived just in time to see the entire scene. He didn't shout, he didn't move immediately. His silence was heavier than any words. I could feel the storm behind his eyes, the fury building quietly as he watched the woman who had ruined my life act without consequence. In that moment, I understood that things had changed. I was hurt and frightened, yes, but now someone who truly cared for me had seen everything. As I lay at the bottom of the stairs, pain and shock consuming me, I realized this was the point of no return. The betrayal was exposed, the truth laid bare, and the reckoning was coming. Nothing would ever be the same again, and the people who thought they could break me had awakened something far stronger than they imagined. I woke up in the hospital, my body aching, every movement sending sharp pain through my ribs and wrist. The room smelled of antiseptic, and the beeping machines reminded me how close I had come to serious injury. My father sat beside me, his hand resting on mine, but his eyes were stormy, full of a quiet rage that made me feel both safe and unsettled. He didn't speak at first, he didn't need to. The anger in his gaze said everything. Ruth and Evan came to see me only once. Their visit was brief and awkward. Ruth stood by the door, acting like she was concerned, but the words she spoke were empty. "It's family business," she said, as if that excused everything she had done. Evan said little, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding any real emotion or responsibility. They stayed just long enough to see that I was alive, and then left, confident that I wouldn't take action against them. As soon as the door closed behind them, my father stood up. He didn't yell, he didn't storm out in anger. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out with a calm intensity that made me shiver. It was different from the father I knew. This was someone who had seen the worst and was already plotting how to set it right. I watched him make calls on his phone, quietly but purposefully. He revisited old contacts from his law enforcement days, people who could dig into records, track movements, and uncover secrets. Every call, every whispered word, seemed to build a network of information that I couldn't fully see, but could feel growing. He wasn't just reacting, he was planning, calculating, making sure no one could escape the consequences of what they had done. Sitting there, I realized something had shifted. Before, my father had been protective, always trusting me to handle situations, letting me find my way. But now, seeing me hurt like this, he had become a force I had never fully imagined. His calm anger was terrifying and comforting at the same time. It made me believe that justice was coming, even if I wasn't the one delivering it. As the hours passed, I felt my fear mix with a strange sense of hope. My father's presence reminded me that I wasn't alone, and that the people who had thought they could hurt me without consequences had underestimated both me and him. Every plan he set in motion, every call he made, was a promise that Ruth and Evan would pay for what they had done. Even though my body was weak and sore, I felt a growing strength in my spirit. I knew the world had changed. Nothing would ever be the same, and the reckoning that had begun in that hospital room would not stop until those who had caused me pain were made to face the truth. That quiet rage in my father's eyes was only the beginning, and I understood that the path ahead, though difficult, was already being paved for justice. Once I was home from the hospital, my father wasted no time. He began quietly gathering everything he could to hold Ruth and Evan accountable. He started with the evidence I had collected, messages, recordings, and notes I had kept of Ruth's threats and manipulations. Every detail I had saved became a piece of the puzzle, and he used them carefully, connecting dots I hadn't even noticed. Richard didn't stop there. He reached out to people from Ruth's past, former employees who had worked in her businesses. From them, he uncovered secrets Ruth had worked hard to hide: tax irregularities, hidden accounts, and unexplained assets. She had always presented herself as proper and careful, but behind the scenes, she had been reckless and dishonest. Each new piece of information made my father's plan clearer, like a wall closing in around her. Meanwhile, Evan's affair was starting to surface in ways he couldn't control. Word spread at his workplace, and colleagues whispered about what had happened. His reputation suffered, and he began facing consequences he had never imagined. It was small at first, stares in the office, awkward conversations. But it grew, creating cracks in the life he had taken for granted. Through it all, I watched my father work. Even as I recovered from my injuries, I felt a growing sense of security. The fear and helplessness I had felt before were slowly replaced with relief and awe. He moved carefully, never rushing, but nothing escaped his attention. Each call, each meeting, each document he collected was part of a larger plan to make sure Ruth and Evan could not harm me again. It was strange to see how methodical he was. There was no shouting, no threats, no rash decisions. Everything was deliberate, precise, and unstoppable. It felt as if he was peeling their lives apart, layer by layer, exposing everything they had tried to hide. I realized that revenge didn't have to be chaotic or loud. It could be quiet, patient, and devastating. As days turned into weeks, the effect of his work began to show. I saw Ruth start to panic, always looking over her shoulder, worried about what might come next. Evan seemed smaller, anxious, and guilty, no longer the confident man he had once been. And I felt a strange mix of relief and justice, knowing that my father was not just protecting me. He was teaching them that cruelty has consequences. In that time, I understood something important. Real power isn't about anger or shouting. It's about patience, intelligence, and timing. My father's plan was just beginning, and I could already feel the inevitability of the reckoning coming for those who had tried to destroy me. The consequences of my father's careful planning started to hit Ruth and Evan hard. The evidence he had gathered reached the right people, and soon Ruth's businesses were under investigation. The IRS examined every detail, uncovering hidden accounts, missing taxes, and fraudulent transactions she had thought were safe. The elegant, controlling woman who had terrified me for years now looked nervous, worried, and cornered. Evan's life began to unravel at the same time. His affair became public knowledge, and his colleagues at work whispered, pointed, and finally confronted him. The scandal ruined his professional reputation, and before long, he lost his job. The man who had once stood tall and confident now appeared small, anxious, and uncertain. The social world they had relied on, their friends, their connections, and the respect they thought they commanded, started to crumble around them. Ruth, desperate and frightened, tried to turn the tables. She attempted to frame my father for harassment, claiming he was overstepping, threatening, or using his position unfairly. For a moment, it seemed like they might have a chance to escape the consequences. But I had kept everything I could, recorded phone calls, messages, and all the hospital reports documenting my injuries. When I handed them over, the truth became undeniable. Ruth's lies and manipulations were exposed, leaving her with no defense. The legal system moved quickly after that. In a brutal twist, Ruth was arrested for perjury and obstruction of justice. The same woman who had shoved me down the stairs, who had fueled lies and encouraged betrayal, was now facing real punishment for her actions. Watching her taken away, I felt a complicated mix of relief and satisfaction. The fear and pain she had caused me could never fully disappear, but finally, justice had caught up to her. Evan, abandoned by everyone, turned to me. He came to my door, pleading, begging, and crying, asking for forgiveness for everything he had done. But in that moment, I realized something important. I owed him nothing. His betrayal had been cruel, deliberate, and damaging, and his mother had manipulated him into doing things that hurt me deeply. I had survived, my dignity remained intact, and I didn't need to save him from the consequences of his actions. I watched him leave, humiliated and broken, and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The fear, the anxiety, and the pain of the past months began to ease. For the first time in a long time, I felt free from the shadow Ruth and Evan had cast over my life. My father's presence, his planning, and his unwavering support had brought justice to the people who tried to harm me. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about survival, dignity, and finally reclaiming control of my life. Ruth and Evan had fallen, and I was left standing, stronger and wiser than I had ever been. It was the moment I realized that cruelty always carries a price, and sometimes justice arrives quietly, methodically, and completely. A few weeks after everything had started to fall apart, Ruth found me outside the courthouse. Her face was pale, her expensive clothes slightly rumpled, and her eyes filled with a mix of anger, fear, and shame. She stopped me before I could enter, her voice sharp and trembling. "You've destroyed our family," she accused, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Look what you've done. How could you ruin everything?" I felt my body tense, a shiver running through me. For a moment, I trembled, not from fear but from the memory of all she had done to me. The anger, the betrayal, and the pain flashed back in vivid colors. But I also felt stronger than I had ever felt before. I straightened my shoulders and looked her in the eye. "I didn't destroy your family," I said clearly, my voice steady despite the shaking inside me. "All I did was reveal the truth you worked so hard to bury." Ruth's face twisted with disbelief. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, my father stepped forward. Richard had been quiet, calm, and collected throughout all of this, but now his presence was enough to make her falter. He stood beside me, his tall frame steady, his eyes cold and proud. "Ruth," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "you will live with the consequences of your own cruelty. No one else made these choices for you. You are responsible for what has happened." Her face went pale again, and I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She tried to protest, tried to argue that she was innocent, that it wasn't her fault, but it was too late. The police were already stepping forward to escort her away. She screamed, a high, desperate sound, full of rage and humiliation, as they guided her toward the car. I watched her struggle, her power gone, her control shattered. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The woman who had caused so much pain, who had tried to manipulate, humiliate, and hurt me, was finally facing the consequences. I felt my father's hand squeeze mine briefly, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had endured together. As the police car drove away with Ruth inside, I realized something important. I didn't need to shout, fight, or plead. The truth, patience, and determination had done everything for me. The confrontation was over, the reckoning complete, and I finally felt free from the shadow of fear and cruelty that had haunted my life for so long. After everything that had happened, I needed time to heal. The physical pain from my injuries faded slowly, but the emotional scars lingered longer. I started going to therapy, talking through the betrayal, the fear, and the anger that had built up over the years. It was hard at first, reliving the moments, but little by little, I began to feel lighter. I also found a new job, one that gave me purpose and independence. Being able to focus on something positive, something that was mine, helped me regain a sense of control over my life. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was living for myself, not for anyone else's approval or expectations. For a while, I moved back home with my father. Being with him brought comfort I hadn't realized I needed. We spent quiet evenings together, talking or sometimes sitting in silence, just enjoying each other's company. Our bond grew stronger, built on love, respect, and shared understanding. He didn't have to say much. His presence alone reminded me that I was safe and valued. Through it all, I began to understand something important. Revenge had given me justice, yes, but it hadn't fixed every hurt or made the past disappear. What it did do was restore my dignity and remind me that I deserved respect and honesty. That realization gave me strength, a foundation to move forward without fear or doubt. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, my father looked at me with a soft smile. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "You survived, and you did it with grace." His words filled me with warmth, and I realized that his pride wasn't just for surviving the events. It was for staying true to myself, for holding on to my integrity even when everything seemed lost. I started to smile again, genuinely. Not a forced smile, but one that reflected hope and a sense of freedom. I began making plans for the future, thinking about the life I wanted to create for myself, independent of anyone who had tried to control or hurt me. Slowly, the fear and anger that had once consumed me began to fade. I was learning to trust again, to enjoy small moments, and to focus on the people who truly cared for me. My father's support, the therapy, and the work I put into rebuilding my life reminded me that it was possible to heal. For the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace life fully. I knew challenges might still come, but I also knew I had the strength to face them. I had survived, learned, and grown, and now I could finally live for myself. Months after everything had settled, I found myself standing in front of the old house one last time. It looked different now, smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves carried the echoes of the chaos that had taken place inside. The house was going to be sold to cover Ruth's debts, and I knew it would no longer hold the power it once had over my life. Standing there, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a quiet sense of triumph. I walked toward the staircase where it had all happened. The very steps that had once sent me tumbling down, leaving me hurt, frightened, and powerless, now felt different. I placed my hand on the banister, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, and I took a deep breath. There was no fear this time, no trembling in my legs. Slowly, deliberately, I began to climb the stairs, step by step, each one a symbol of how far I had come. As I reached the top, I paused and looked around. The rooms were empty, the echoes of the past lingering faintly, but they couldn't touch me anymore. I realized that the house, the people who had hurt me, and the fear I had carried for so long no longer had control over my life. I had survived, I had endured, and I had emerged stronger than I had ever imagined. Standing there, I thought about everything I had learned through the pain. The people who try to break you, who betray and hurt you, often teach you the most important lessons. They show you how strong you really are, how much you can endure, and how far you can rise even when everything seems against you. Ruth had tried to destroy me, but in the end, she had only revealed the strength that was already inside me. I could hear my father's voice softly from outside the house. He had been watching me, his presence steady and calm, silently relieved that justice had been served. He didn't need to say anything. I could see it in the way he stood, the pride and love in his eyes. After months of fear, uncertainty, and pain, it felt good to finally feel safe, understood, and supported. I took one last look at the staircase, the symbol of both my past suffering and my triumph. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the house behind, leaving the fear and the cruelty with it. Every step I took felt lighter, freer, as if I were carrying only my strength, my courage, and my dignity forward. That day, I understood something clearly. The trials we face, no matter how cruel or painful, can teach us more than any easy victory ever could. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who show us just how resilient and strong we really are. And as I walked away, I knew that life ahead would be mine to live fully, with courage, pride, and hope. Do you think Amelia handled everything the right way by standing up to her mother-in-law and letting justice take its course? Or should she have forgiven Evan and Ruth despite their betrayal? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm really curious to hear your opinion. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out.